A big thanks to Gymnastic Planet for supporting this episode. Gymnastics is a challenging sport, but having the right tools in your gym bag really does help. Gymnastic Planet is a leading manufacturer and distributor of essential training kit. They provide the best quality products, including world-class speed equipment, handguards, and chalk. They also specialise in club services like venue design, maintenance, and installation. Backed by decades of experience, from competing and coaching to club management, Gymnastic Planet aims to help gymnasts succeed and enjoy their craft. If you'd like to find out more, visit gymnasticplanet.com. In this episode of the Sam Oldham podcast, I'm joined by Ellie Black. Ellie is the most successful female Canadian gymnast of all time. She's also a 3 times World Championship medalist, and at the Paris 2024 Olympic Games, she helped Team Canada finish 5th, and she finished 6th individually. And this is Ellie's story. Ellie, thank you for joining us today on the podcast. I've known you for a long time, and I've always been a big fan of your gymnastics. I guess to start off with, just tell me a little bit about what your life looks like now being towards the latter stages of your career, but at the start of a brand new Olympic cycle.
Yeah, well, thanks for having me. I'm super excited to be on this with you. And it's kind of crazy. Like, I look back at when I was first getting into senior and I went to my first Olympic Games, and I definitely wouldn't have expected to still be in the sport this long and still be competing at the highest level and going into a 5th Olympic quad. That's kind of crazy. But now when I'm here, I just feel so much gratitude to be able to do it every day, to go into the gym, to do what I love, to have such a great team supporting me, and yeah, to wake up every day and just do something that really I'm passionate about and I'm inspired by, and you want to make a difference within the sport. So I think that's something that gets me up every morning, and going into the next Olympic quad, it's kind of surreal. But I think it's exciting. I'm really excited for our team, for our Canadian team. The girls are doing awesome. Our men's team is doing awesome. So I'm just really excited for the next few years and what's to come.
Are you planning, Ellie, to do all 4 events in the next Olympic cycle, or just do a few events and specialize?
Goal would be to do all 4. I am a bit older, so I don't tend to do floor at the highest level as often, and kind of the same with vault. I try and take a little bit of load or a little bit of impact off around certain times of the year, and then build towards the peak of the year to try and have my harder routine then. But also over the years throughout the quad, working towards the Olympic Games, I think it would be about being strategic, making sure that I'm not tiring out my body or putting too much impact on my body over the first few years, before moving into the actual year of qualification, which is really important for the Olympic Games and qualifying your team.
Do you feel like you're going to have to approach this cycle slightly differently to the last, I guess it's 4 cycles that you've done now, Ellie? Like, being aware that you are getting older, you are towards the end of your career, potentially. You might want to carry on like Chusavitna, right, until you're 50. But do you feel like you're going to have to approach this one slightly differently to, let's say, the previous Olympic cycle?
I think every Olympic cycle has brought its ups and downs, and that's made it so that I need to adapt and I need to be flexible. And I think that is also that's helpful. And I think that's something that's going to help me in this quad. The last Olympic quad was 1 year shorter, and I was basically figuring out if my ankle could do gymnastics or not again at the highest level. So that was kind of a crazy 3 years. I really had to adapt. I had to try a lot of different avenues and see what was going to work. And so now I feel like I've kind of figured that out with my team. We know what's a good amount to do, but still over the next 4 years, we're going to have to be thinking about, how much load I can handle, be able to pivot throughout the year if necessary. But I think over the years, you gain a lot of experience. With every obstacle or all the adversity you have to face, you gain a lot of experience going through it. And that builds your confidence to know that no matter what you're faced with, you're going to be able to handle it, or you're going to be able to find another plan. And you just have to believe in that and believe in the team you have around you. So I think for me, this next few years, I definitely will have to be smart with my training and how many competitions I do and what I do at those competitions. But I have a lot of faith in the team around me and myself to be able to handle whatever that looks like, and just try and make the best of it. Because at the end of the day, I also just want to enjoy these next few years as much as possible. So that's what I'm trying to remind myself in the gym every day, even if it's a bad day, just trying to get through and be like, you know, you can do gymnastics for a long time. You can't necessarily do it at the highest level forever. So I just want to kind of soak up those moments.
It's really interesting what you say there, Ellie, about the last cycle being a year shorter than a normal Olympic cycle. Is that something that you think a lot of athletes are going to have to factor into the next 4 years? Because I guess if you're looking at the Commonwealth Games halfway through that cycle, and then after that, another 2 World Championships before the Olympics, you're probably going to feel that difference of that extra year, I imagine.
I think everyone's going to feel it. I think it's going to feel a lot longer. I think there's going to be a high priority on making sure that we're targeting longevity and mental and physical health, and making sure we're watching for signs of burnout. Because I think people are excited, and it's great. You're excited after the Olympic quad, but it's 4 years. So we really do have to make sure that we're kind of planning, pacing, checking in on ourselves. And I think there is going to be a point where I think we're like, oh my gosh, we're only halfway through the quad, or we're almost, like only halfway through, but we still have 2 more years left. So I think that's going to be, I think, especially for the athletes who are in the last quad as well, it's going to feel like a really big difference. And the mentality of just thinking, oh my gosh, it's 4 years, not 3, it does have an impact. So I think creating a plan is really important. And I know for the younger generation too, I think they don't have a lot of experience with that. So making sure that you're watching for signs of burnout as you're trying to push and increase all your difficulty as we work towards LA.
Do you think, Ellie, that scheduling in rest, now that you are as experienced as you are, is actually almost just as important as the plan for preparing for the competitions? And what I mean by that is that, I'm sure there's days where you feel great, but actually if you're thinking on a 4-year cycle, you almost have to hold yourself back a little bit. And how difficult is that to do as an athlete that maybe enjoys working hard?
Yeah, it's really tough. It is really tough. It's really hard for me. I struggle with taking time off. And I think it is true. You have to look at the big picture. And yes, there is a smaller picture of what your, yearly goals are going to be. But if your main goal is the 4-year Olympic quad, sometimes when you're in in a moment, you have to make that decision based off of, okay, yes, what are our goals for this year? But also what are our really long-term goals? And how is that going to affect my process and my preparation towards that long-term goal of 4 years away? Like, weigh the pros and cons. But I have learned, and especially over COVID, I feel like we learned a lot about being able to actually take time off and how important it is for your mental health and your physical health to actually take time to rest and recover, and how much that actually impacts your ability to come back and train and compete and feel good and feel refreshed. So I've definitely spent a lot more time being okay with, or starting to try and be okay with, taking time away from the sport, or taking vacation, or taking, a day or so off every so often. We try and mix into my schedule, a couple days off every, few months or month, try and put a block of like a couple days off together, just to make sure, if it's not already built in, to make sure that you have just a few days off for your mental and physical health, and that you feel like you're coming back refreshed. And I know I get a lot of anxiety when I take time off of training, because I'm thinking about the return, and I'm thinking about, getting back to the level that I was at. But you're not thinking about the actual pros that that's going to bring you, because if you only ever train at the highest level all the time, you will burn out and you won't be able to maintain for 4 years. So you have to find those small little times throughout the year, every month, to kind of take a few days off for yourself. And that actually makes you feel like you want to come back, and you're excited and you're motivated. And it actually doesn't take you as long to get back to the level that you expect. I think there's just a lot of anxiety built up around it, especially for me, because I didn't do it a lot. And it wasn't really built into the mentality of gymnastics to take time off and to rest. It's always about keeping going and trying to push every single day.
When you've become a 4-time Olympian, Ellie, and you're looking ahead to try and compete in your 5th Olympic Games, and you've competed at the highest level in your sport and won medals at each of those levels. Are you really now looking at, right, my priority is that Olympic Games in 4 years' time, and I back engineer my plan from that? Because what I'm asking is, to get yourself motivated for another Commonwealth Games or another World Championships when you've competed in them so many times and won medals in all of them, is the Olympic Games like your main focus and your drive? Or are you in the position where, a lot of athletes say, I just take it 1 year at a time, but like actually their focus is the Olympic Games in 4 years' time? Like, where do you sit with that?
I feel very seen by what you just said. But I definitely am like, my main goal is the whole quad and the end of that quad. And so the main goal would be LA, but it is a year-to-year process. And especially with me and, how long I've been in the sport, I know that you have to kind of look at it as day to day and year to year, but you also have to have that like long-term goal that is motivating you. So I think, yeah, that's like a loaded question a little bit, because for me, it's a bit of both. I think you have to have that long-term goal. And I know in the back of my mind, this has happened to me for like 3 quads. Every time people were like, are you going to stay? Are you going to do the next Olympics? And I'm like, I don't know. I just want to take it 1 year at a time. But in my head, I was like, that's what I want to do. So I feel very seen by that, but it is true. I think you do have to have a long-term goal, and know that it is going to be a day-to-day and a year-to-year process to get there. And you might have to pivot. The path isn't going to look exactly as you plan, but working towards that, it helps you to structure your years, maybe what competitions you're aiming to compete at. And for me, a lot of it too is like, how can I help my team? How can I help my team to qualify for the Olympic Games, and grow the sport within my country?
Let's take it back then, Ellie, to when you started gymnastics. What age were you when you started?
I started gymnastics when I was about 6 or 7, and then I started competing when I was 9.
And can you remember it being like an instant love when you started the sport?
Oh my gosh. I remember coming in and I started in rec, and it was just like, you're a kid on a playground. You're having the most fun. There are so many fun things to play on. You can go in the foam pit, you can flip around. And I remember my longtime coach, KG, he actually would come in and he would look at some of the athletes that had perspective for going into the competitive program. And I remember, I don't remember the time, but I remember being told, he definitely thought that I had potential. And then I got moved into the competitive program, and I moved in a little bit before I was actually able to start competing, and started learning some of those skills and getting integrated in. But it was just something that I absolutely loved, and I wanted to spend all my time there. And I actually did figure skating and gymnastics for a little bit alongside each other, but I hate being cold. So going to the cold rink wasn't necessarily what I wanted to do. And going to the gym where it was warm and I could come play with my friends and learn to flip, that was something that I knew that I wanted to do. So I feel very lucky that I was actually able to find the sport that I was so passionate about. And I was able to, with the support of my family, to be able to pursue that.
What natural gifts or maybe talents do you think you brought into the gymnastics club when you first walked in, Ellie, that maybe those coaches saw in you?
Yeah, so I was a pretty energetic and powerful and strong kid. And so I remember someone had suggested to my dad and my parents that they put me in gymnastics, and they never did gymnastics as kids. So they didn't know too much about it, but I got, into the sport, and naturally that really was an ability that helped me to learn a lot of skills quickly because I was strong and I had a lot of power. It was learning to control my power, and I did not have a lot of flexibility or a lot of, I'll say like technique or clean legs, any of that. But I learned a lot of skills really quickly because I had a lot of just natural ability in the strength department and power. So I think that allowed me to progress quickly. But if you look at, the first few years when I was competing in the sport and when I was still getting in from junior to senior, I was not a really clean athlete. I wasn't super flexible, but I had a lot of difficulty. And so something that I've worked on over time is working on the artistic side, working on cleaning up my gymnastics and, pairing that with also controlling my power.
In the early years when you started, Ellie, what did gymnastics in Canada look like? Particularly on the women's side. I know that in 2004 in Athens, Kyle Schufelt won the gold medal on the floor. But what did the women's system look like in Canada at that time when you were first getting involved in the sport?
Yeah, so I actually remember watching the Olympic Games in 2008 on TV. And I was like, that's what I want to do one day. Like, I want to go to the Olympics. I want to represent Canada. My coach, David Kikuchi, he was representing Canada. So he came from my club. So I was like, why not? He can do it from my club. Why not? And we kind of started to put a plan together of like what that might look like. But I remember at that time, we hadn't had a female team qualified to the Olympic Games in a really long time. And our men's program had a team for multiple years. They were doing really well. Kyle Schufelt winning medals. We had a really successful men's team. And our women's team was more individual. And so as I was going into the 2012 Olympic year, I was, just a small girl from Nova Scotia, wasn't on a national team, just trying to get experience to get integrated into the team. So I didn't really know how it worked. But at that time, I think it was just, there was a lot of individuals and we weren't doing a lot of teamwork. And then we started to change our mindset to, okay, how can we actually work together? And if we work together, we can also individually improve, but we can collaborate with our coaches, with our IST team, with our resources, get the athletes to actually like buy in and want to support each other. And that's how you build a strong team. And so I feel like in London, we actually had a really great team together. And that was kind of just the start, I think, of that team mentality that we've worked on for so many years of collaborating and building on team and making that super important. And it was very interesting. A lot of those men's athletes that, were on those teams prior, that just like through the ebbs and flows of gymnastics, most of them retired or they moved out, and there was a little bit of a gap on the men's side. And so they hadn't had a men's team for a while, but they qualified their first men's team this Olympics in Paris. So that was the first actually Olympics that I had a women's team and a men's team at the Olympics. And so I think that was pretty incredible. And I think just thinking about that team mentality and how working together to improve gymnastics as a whole throughout our country is really, really helpful.
What advantages do you think potentially it gave you, Ellie, growing up in a gym where there was high-level men's gymnasts around you? And maybe what would you describe the differences between the women's side of the sport and the men's side of the sport being?
Yeah, so I grew up and I trained with a really great group of girls kind of up until I almost got until the senior category. And then a lot of those girls had moved on, and I actually didn't have a lot of training partners. And at that point, my longtime coach, KG, was starting to work with David, and they were both kind of coaching with me. And David would travel with me, and then eventually David kind of took over the reins. But Dave is a men's athlete, and he coached a lot of male gymnasts. So I actually trained with a lot of guys when I was around my first, second, even third Olympic Games. I still train with a lot of guys. But I had a really core group of male athletes that I trained with around that time. And it's very interesting because men's gymnastics, their mindset compared to women's gymnastics is very different. And I think both sides can learn from each other. The men's gymnastics is a little bit more laid back. You have 6 events. You can't spend as much time on each apparatus, overthinking or, training too much. You have to get them all done. And also there's some kind of mentality of like, just keep going, keep fighting. Even if you fall down, it's like, get back up. You might laugh about it, or, you kind of poke fun with each other, but you kind of get back up and you keep going. And not to say there's no hardships or anything like that, but it's just a little bit more light than the women's side. And the women's side could definitely be really, really intense. And there was no laughing when you fell. It was a lot of tears or crying or a lot of high emotions, very, very serious, 4 events. So a lot of time spent on those apparatus, trying to perfect everything. And so I think there are definitely pros from each side. And I think if you take a little bit of, a little bit more of the women's structure and a little bit more of their, seriousness at times, but also a little bit of the guys' ability to just get back up and keep trying and kind of have that bigger picture and be a little bit lighter. When you put those together, I think it creates something that's really special. And so I think growing up with the guys, it gives me a little bit of a different mentality, maybe not overtraining as much, not worrying about the warm up so much. Women's warm up is so structured. Guys is a little bit more chill. You can go wherever you want, So I remember there was one competition where I showed up and I don't think I did the full general warm up, and it was a Canadian competition. And I showed up like halfway through, and everyone was like freaking out because they're like, is she coming? Is she going to do it? But I was like, I just need rest. I don't need to do a ton of warm up. I'm just going to come in, do what I need, like on those 2 apparatus, do the one touch and the other ones, and then go. But that was really a lot of my coach and my coach's mentality on the men's side that was brought in. So it is very interesting growing up with a lot of, male gymnasts in the gym, and how I think that's had an impact on my mentality or perspective of training day to day, not worrying about overtraining too much, having more of a longevity kind of mindset, and then also trying not to, overdo it in the sense of being like too rigid or too structured.
Why do you think, Ellie, that maybe the men's side of the sport and the women's don't collaborate more? What do you think that is? Because I always found that confusing growing up, even training at a national centre at the same time. The men and the women would never communicate about anything. Like, they wouldn't dream of communicating about techniques or anything like that. I always found that quite peculiar. We're representing the same country. Why don't we collaborate and work together? Because there's so much that we could take in terms of artistry from the women's side of the sport. And equally, there'll be stuff that the women's side of the sport could take from the men's side of the sport. But yeah, that lack of collaboration always, it confused me, that did. Why do you think that is?
Honestly, I don't know. And I have been talking about this for a while. I think it would be fabulous just because in Canada right now, our national training center is the same for the men's and the women's. And I think it would be great to do some collaborations, or even just for your athletes to get to know who's on your men's national team. And before you go to the Olympic Games, be like, oh, hey, I've never met you before. Good luck. We want to work on bringing the whole sport together and being cohesive and learning from each other. And I think there is a lot that both sides of the sport can really learn from each other. And so me growing up, Dave was always all about the idea of going to other clubs, working with other coaches, getting their, perspective or knowledge on what I was trying to learn, especially if he didn't know. Because if he didn't know and someone else did, why not go and collaborate and work? And we're all about that now too. If people want to come train with us, if people have questions, let us know. We are here to help because we want to collaborate. We want to work together. And sometimes something else just clicks that someone else says. But I have also worked with some of the men's coaches, whether it's on vaulting or technique, because I think it is so important. There's so much on the men's side that I think the women can learn from, and vice versa. But I'm actually not sure why we don't work together more often. And I think there's kind of an untapped potential there. And maybe that's just my mindset of coming from training with athletes on the men's side for so long as I grew up, and it's way more natural to me to be integrated with the male side. I used to go to some of the men's training camps with my coach because we had men's athletes. So I would go along. I wouldn't necessarily take part in their camp, but I would be there, do their conditioning. A lot of my conditioning was based off of, men's apparatus. I do presses on the P-bars. So I think there is a level that we haven't really stepped into yet. And I think it could be super beneficial for the men's and women's side of gymnastics.
Yeah, I often wonder whether a lot of it is down to ego and people not wanting to look like they don't know the answers to something. So they just pretend that they know the answer to everything, and I'd rather not engage in that conversation. And yeah, I wonder whether it's that. And then maybe maybe one piece of that puzzle is that typically you're an exception to that rule, but female gymnasts are competing at a high level at a younger age. Men are maybe a little bit older, and there's that disconnect because how does a 25-year-old man relate to a 15-year-old girl? That's quite difficult, right? So maybe it's a little bit of that, but I think you have a really interesting perspective having worked with a Canadian male gymnast and been around a lot of male gymnasts throughout your career. So it's been really interesting just listening to your insights on that there. Tell me a little bit about your trajectory towards 2012 then, Ellie. As a junior, were you a really successful junior, or was it more of a slow process and then all at once in the build-up to the Olympic Games?
Yeah, so I think when I first started competing provincially, I was like quite good within Nova Scotia. It's a smaller province. The other provinces were way better. So then when I started to go to the national championships in the novice and junior category, at the beginning, I was like near the bottom of the pack, but it was pretty motivating to me because I got to see what these other athletes were doing and what the level was outside of my province that I wanted to like work towards being able to do. So I remember slowly over the years kind of building my way up. And I remember in the junior category, I was still really not great at uneven bars. Uneven bars was a struggle for me for a really long time, and that affected my all-around score. But I was really good at vault and floor and beam. And I actually won the balance beam in the junior category. I can't remember if it was my first or second year. It must have been my second year. But that was a huge confidence booster because it was like, wow, okay, you have the potential to be at the top of these amazing athletes throughout Canada. And we just need to like continue building and continue working. And my first year senior, I was actually injured. I broke my big toe. So I missed my whole first season of competing in senior category. And I came back at the end of the year. It was in the fall. I competed at the competition Marseille, I believe, in France. And I dislocated my elbow on my first competition back. Oh, wow. And this was going into the Olympic year. And I worked really hard to like heal that injury and get back because we were like, this is the Olympic year. Let's try and like see if we can just get back in time and be able to get back and qualify for that Olympic team. But really didn't know whether it was possible or not. And a lot of, I think, going into the 2012 Olympic year was like, we had seen small, like little confidence boosters or small results that kind of were reminders that I did have the potential and I could do it. It just kind of had to come all together. But then I kind of ran out of time. So as we were competing in 2012, it was like, any experience, any opportunity I can get, let's take it, let's try it. And I remember really pushing my vault because that's where Canada needed help was on vault. We needed higher vaulting scores. So we saw that as my potential to get onto the Olympic team and my opportunity to help Canada. So we really focused on upgrading my vault, and it kind of like all came together throughout that year. And I ended up getting that final spot on the London Olympic team. And I think that was probably to help with vault because we needed a vault score. So that kind of ended up working. But I wouldn't say I came like out of the gates at the top, you know, and I was at the top from like novice, junior to senior. I was kind of like in the bottom. There are a few events that I was good at, but it never really all kind of came together. And even in London, I wasn't allowed near the bars. Like I was not good at uneven bars. So I did beam, floor, and vault. I stayed away from the bars. But then after that, I really wanted to work on uneven bars because I wanted to become an all-around gymnast.
Were there any long-lasting impacts from that elbow dislocation, Ellie? Because that sounds like quite a frightening injury, to be honest.
Yeah, so actually I probably have longer lasting impacts from my big toe that I broke earlier that season. Oh, wow. So I broke my big toe. I was working on a front tuck half on beam. I landed on the side, I dislocated it, and I chipped a piece of bone out of the joint. So we actually weren't sure whether I was going to be able to fully get back to gymnastics or not. They went in, they had a plan. They kind of had to pivot during the surgery. It ended up healing, but it doesn't move nearly the same way as my other big toe. So that's changed a lot of mechanics in my ankle and my foot. So, I mean, I've just kind of like managed and been able to continue, which is great because I didn't have to fuse my big toe. But coming off of that and coming back into, my first competition and then dislocating my elbow, I just had too much energy and too much power I was doing my 2.5 step out in the one touch on the floor, and I over rotated and I just dislocated it. But I was really lucky with that elbow dislocation because there were no like pieces of bone or anything that was like chipped off. It was a very clean dislocate. So they were able to put it back in, and I was just able to go as is and take the time to heal and then work my way back into training and competition. But so I was pretty fortunate with that one because I know sometimes it does have to, become something that needs surgery or takes a lot of time to recover from. But there were a few years that I like taped it up really, really aggressively because I just had a lot of fear with that elbow and the stability for a long time. But I would say it's only really affected me on a few things here and there. And I think those first few years were the toughest.
When you first started performing the 2.5 like step out, Ellie, this was quite a long time ago, right? So maybe you didn't have the support from a sports science and medicine team. Were you doing anything specifically outside of gymnastics to prepare your one leg to take that amount of load? Or were you just literally doing the skill?
Honestly, I did a lot of conditioning in the gym, but it was, it's pretty general gymnastics conditioning, but we were very strong. But there was nothing that was like specifically for that skill, stepping out on that one leg. Again, I had a lot of power. So a lot of the time it was just trying to control myself. But I think I've learned a lot over the years and utilizing strength and conditioning, injury prevention. My physio, she comes into the gym and she actually does specific exercises for specific skills that we are learning or we have had problems with, or when we're recovering from injury, what we might have issues with. And so we actually look at specific skills and specific injuries and have those correlations and then work on like specific exercises for injury prevention and strengthening. But at that time, we didn't really have a lot of that. And so I will say we were very strong athletes because my coach at the time, his philosophy was a lot on just strengthening your body so you're able to do these skills and handle the load. But we definitely could have done it a little bit more, skill specific. But I think at least I had that, which was like a really, really strong base, was to have a strong body and strong frame to be able to handle the impacts that gymnastics has.
And maybe that's a great example of how far the sport has come in that time, right? Because maybe if you were to learn that skill now, fresh, you would approach it with specifically conditioning your body to handle that type of a skill, but that just didn't exist, 10 to 15 years ago. So, that's really interesting. I always watched that move and thought, wow, that's crazy.
Yeah, I've only ever seen, I think, a couple women competed, and it's something unique. And I think that was always my coach's thought was, how can I was scared of backwards too for a long time. So I did a lot of forward skills, and that was unique and not a lot of people did it. So then my coach, we kind of worked with my ability and my power, but then also on the side of what are some skills that people aren't doing, and it will kind of stand out in a little bit of a different way. And so my gymnastics has always been a little bit different or a little bit unique. And so I think that was just kind of one of those first skills that I did that was very different from everyone else.
Ellie, can you tell me about your experience at the Rio 2016 Olympic Games? You obviously did incredibly well individually. Just what do you remember of that competition? How important was that in your journey to where you are right now?
Yeah, so going into the Rio Olympics was very different than going into the London Games. When I went into London, I was very oblivious. Like, I didn't know, I hadn't competed at any major games before I went. I didn't really understand the level and the impact and where, you might rank against other people. I was just happy to be there, happy to help my team, didn't really know what was happening. I was just like, this is awesome. So I think that helped with some of that stress and pressure of competing. Obviously, you always have that want to compete well and do it for your team, but I didn't have that same comparison to other athletes or where you might end up in the rankings. It was never about that. It was just about helping my team and not wanting to, let my team down, especially because I was the least experienced on my team. So going into Rio, I had more experience. I was one of a few athletes on my team who had been to the Olympics before. I was one of the strongest all-arounders. I had competed at the World Championships. I'd competed at the Pan American Games, Commonwealth Games. I had more experience, and I had, which I think it didn't help me, was I had an idea of where I could rank and where I could what finals I could make or what my potential could be. And I try not to think about results, because sometimes I feel like that is just something that takes away from actually what we need to do, which is focus on our gymnastics, focus on the process. But I knew that I was way more nervous going into that competition because I had put too much pressure and stress on myself to make finals, to try and win a medal for Canada. And you could kind of see that in my first day of competition in Rio. I had a lot of stress and a lot of anxiety and a lot of pressure on my shoulders. And especially on balance beam, I wanted to make the final and I fell. And I did a good job of coming back and getting some good scores for my team after that. But it was almost like after I had made that mistake, it took some of that stress and pressure off of me. And I remember coming back in the all-around competition, and it was like redemption. I wanted to go back out there and show what I knew that I was capable of doing. I was still just fresh in the all-around. I had worked on my uneven bars. I've slowly worked towards getting better in the all-around. So I didn't have too much of an expectation for myself in the all-around competition. So I think that also helped. But going in, I just wanted to go in, get redemption on beam, and I had a fabulous all-around competition, and I came 5th, which was a historic result for any Canadian gymnast in the all-around competition. And that to me, I think was oh my gosh, this was pretty incredible. Even though I missed out on this balance beam final, I was still able to do really, really well in the all-around competition, show that I actually had that potential. It worked so hard on the uneven bars. And all of that hard work was kind of paying off. But it was very interesting. I noticed, and that was probably one of the first times that I had that much stress and that much pressure that I felt on my shoulders, and how that actually had impacted my performance and my mentality going into those Olympic Games.
After that Olympic Games, Ellie, how quickly did you turn your focus to the World Championships the year after in Montreal, which was going to be a home championships? And what did that time between getting back from Rio and then getting back into serious training, what was that transition period like?
Yeah, so coming out of Rio, I know that I took some time off. I think I had to just get some scar tissue or something cleaned up in my ankle. So that actually kind of forced me to take a little bit of a break and a little bit of time off. I went to go visit actually one of my friends, Brittany Rogers, one of my teammates at her school in the US. Took some time to heal my ankle and just kind of have a more normal, regular fall. And I think that's really important coming off the Olympic Games, because there is a drop off, and there's a little bit of a blue time, and it's hard if you don't have a plan or you don't have an idea of what you need to do, or if you want to go into the next quad, you have to take time off. Because again, if we're talking about the 4-year period and worrying about burnout and making sure that you're taking time to actually process and recover, it's really important. So that actually gave me the time in the fall to be able to live life a little bit normally, rest my body, heal up whatever I needed to heal up, and then kind of come back. And I knew that I wanted to go for the 2017 World Championships because they were being hosted in Montreal. I couldn't miss the opportunity to compete in my home country at a World Championships. I think that was going to be something that was so, so special. And I actually remember I injured my ankle in January of 2017. I tore a bunch of ligaments, and I had to be in a boot for, a couple months and work my way back towards the World Championships. And so that kind of changed my mindset towards the World Championships, because at the beginning it was like, I want to go, I want to be super strong, I want to do all of these things. And then it was like, I just want to make it there. And I want to make it and be able to have this opportunity to hopefully compete well for Canada, but also compete in front of my, support system across all these Canadian clubs and coaches who have helped me. I want to be able to compete at this in front of my friends and family. And it was a really hard process to kind of get back in time and to be able to, try and get my physical fitness back to where it needed to be, get my confidence in my ankle, get all those skills back that I needed, maybe adjust some of my routines. So it was just, one of a few ankle injuries that I've had along the way. But I was able to get back to that competition, and coming into it, I think maybe with that changed mindset of, okay, I'm just like excited that I made this team. I'm here. I'm able to compete, and all my friends and family can come watch. I think it took a little bit of that stress and pressure off. Of course, competing in front of your home crowd always is nerve-wracking, but it ended up being so successful. And I think just having those amazing support network and people and everyone in the crowd coming to watch, I think it just fueled me. But it was very different than anticipated going into that competition.
To become a world all-around silver medalist, Ellie, is absolutely incredible. How do you approach each of the apparatus in women's gymnastics? What I mean by that is, like, what's your mindset going into doing the floor compared to maybe going into doing bars or going into doing beam? How does that differ between the apparatus?
Yeah, so every apparatus is different, and I worked really, really hard to be able to go and fight for that podium spot in the all-around competition. But every apparatus takes a different approach to it. And so vault for me comes pretty naturally. I was always a strong vaulter when I was younger. So I probably spend, the least amount of time on vault compared to the other apparatus, but it still takes time because I do two different vaults. So I have to spend time on both vaults that I do. And some days I'll just focus on one, and then some days I'll focus a little bit on both. But you have to manage how many vaults you're doing and what that impact is going to be on your body. I usually, during most of the training season, only do vault or floor on a training day. And then when we're in competition season or we're leading up to competition season, I'll kind of mix in a little bit of both, because you're doing a little bit less reps. Because you're going into, routines. So I would just do a couple vaults, get what I need done. And then maybe I'd also do some tumbling and floor. But during most of the season, if I'm doing a heavier training block or heavier training load on one of those apparatus, I'll probably just focus more on one of them on one day of training. Uneven bars and balance beam, I feel like those are the apparatus you train all the time, almost every single day, because they're so technical. And uneven bars is typically one of those apparatus that takes athletes a lot longer to kind of get the feel for. We have 3 leg events and 1 arm event or upper body event. So that one is just kind of the standout, and it takes a little bit longer for athletes to get to the highest level of uneven bars if it's not a natural thing for you, which it wasn't. It took a lot of time. So I've worked a lot on bars. I've done a lot of hours on bars over the past probably 10 years, probably more than the other apparatus. And balance beam is just about confidence and, working on all those technical skills. There's been a lot of change and also artistry. So that's a component that we do on floor and beam as well. But going into something like the World Championships where you're focusing on an all-around result, it's really important to make sure, you're focusing on all those apparatus. But most of my focus probably went on uneven bars and balance beam and then floor cardio when I needed it. But the actual technical side of floor and vault, that's something that came naturally to me. And then I had to work really hard on the artistic side of floor and beam and the jumps and the dance.
What type of an athlete do you need to be, Ellie, to be successful on beam? Because when I watch beam, I almost, and I'm somebody that's never been on a beam, but you get a feeling from someone just seeing their facial expressions on whether or not you think they're going to be able to go through this beam routine. It's really weird. It's like you can tell there's something going on. There's some feedback. I think probably the most confident beam worker I've ever seen was probably Catalina Panor. I remember watching her on beam live and just thinking she has no doubt whatsoever that she's staying on that beam. What type of an athlete makes a great beam worker, and what is that mentality when you get up on the beam that leads you personally to be successful?
Yeah, so I mean, Catalina, incredible beam worker. And I think you said it there is like, there's like no doubt that she's staying on this beam. And I think something about balanced beam workers is that you're very confident and you're kind of exuding that confidence. And you're also being aggressive. So you can't hold back on beam. You can't, shy away or be timid. It's like you have to go, you have to be strong and aggressive. You also have to be very technical, so it does take a lot of practice. But I think some of the best beam workers are actually the ones who can adapt on the fly. And so a lot of the time when you're doing, and I'm sure when you're doing gymnastics, most of the time it's not perfect and you need to adapt while you're going. You need to be able to, if you're going crooked, adapt, fix your body to be able to stay back on this balance beam and make it look like nothing happened. So I think those are the best beam workers, are the ones who are really confident, who are being aggressive, and there's like no doubt that they're going to stay on this beam, but they're actually able to adapt really, really well on the fly. And my coach always says this, but he says it's something that I'm able to do pretty well, is that when I'm in the middle of the skill or I'm approaching a skill and it's a bit off, I'm able to like bring myself back or find a way to adjust when you're in the middle of the skill to find where that beam is again, or adjust to make sure you can make that correction to be able to stay on. And so I think those best beam workers have all of those abilities that kind of come together, and that just shows in their balance beam routines when they're approaching, when they're on the beam. It's like you're just fluidly moving through those skills, and it's not like you're overthinking too much. Obviously you're thinking, but you're not overthinking too much, and you're just kind of like going for it, making it happen, and expecting that you're going to be on that beam.
Is there an element of almost faking it till you make it in terms of that confidence sometimes, Ellie, when you're doing beam? Like you're like almost tricking yourself into feeling confident.
Absolutely. Get up on that beam and you're like, I'm going to crush this, like whether it's straight or not, like I'm going to do it. I'm going to land it perfectly. We're going to do this. You have to I think in gymnastics, it's kind of like that. There is a certain level of like fake it until you make it. Because beam is really hard. It's hard to be confident all the time. It is a scary apparatus. So if you just go in and you kind of boost your confidence in the sense of like kind of just faking it a little bit, it actually does help. And then as you get those reps under your belt, as you compete really well, then that actually does build your confidence.
Ellie, can you tell me a bit about what memories really stick out from the 2018 Commonwealth Games in the Gold Coast, where you did incredibly well, you won the all-around, Canada won as a team. I actually told my little brother to put a bet on Team Canada to win, and he won £800, which is quite a lot of money. So I remember that, so I need to thank you on his behalf for that. But can you tell me like some key moments that maybe stand out from that experience in the Gold Coast?
Yeah, I mean, that was my second Commonwealth Games, and the first Commonwealth Games in Glasgow. I remember I had some good performances, but I had come fourth in a lot of the competitions, and I'd almost just been there and won medals for Canada. And the Commonwealth Games are just such a fun competition. The Commonwealth countries, most of them speak English. Everyone's very nice. Everyone's really approachable. You get the gear, you get to trade, you get to go out there. And typically at the Commonwealth Games too, Canada does pretty well. So we're able to actually contribute to Canada's total of medals. And so that's, a really great feeling. And it's something that you're working towards. And so as a team, we'd been working, I talked a little bit about this earlier, but talking about that team mindset and working on that team cohesiveness. And we'd been working a lot on that. And going into that competition, we knew that we had a really strong team and that we had the potential to go out there and be able to win as a team, but you never know. So I remember, England and Australia are always our biggest competitors. And we were able to come out on top, which was really exciting because we had such a strong team. Not to say everything went perfectly that day, because it didn't, but we had a really strong team who were able to kind of pick up when we had some of those mistakes. And I remember, actually don't really remember the all-around competition all that much. I do remember some of the finals. And I know that I didn't necessarily have like the biggest like medal count, I guess, at that competition. But Canada had done so well. And at that point, I think there's a point in gymnastics too, and maybe it's your maturity level, but you really want yourself to do well, but you want your whole team to do well, and not at the cost of other people making mistakes. You just want everyone to do well, but for you and your team to just do a little bit better. And so even though I didn't necessarily, make all the apparatus finals that I wanted or medal on all of the apparatuses that I did want to, I knew that some of my teammates really had the possibility and they had great performances. And I think that's why that was probably the first time I think our team had won gold at any competition that I'd competed at all together. And so I think that was something that was like just a super special moment and super incredible for us to kind of like experience together, because you know how hard everyone works, what they've been through, and for that to just come together and be able to stand on top of the podium for your country is something very special, but to do it all together is even more special. So I just remember they hosted it so well. It was an incredible competition, and all the other athletes from the other countries too, like such incredible people, so kind, so nice. And it's great to compete with such incredible athletes from around the world.
And then you go into your third Olympic Games, Ellie, in Tokyo. You end up finishing fourth. How have you been able to be so consistent throughout your career, Ellie? Because again, you did really well in Paris in 2024. And that longevity, when you look back now, and I know you're not at the end of your career, right? And you're also probably very humble. But what do you think has allowed you to be that consistent over such a long period of time in a sport when traditionally, I imagine most athletes go to one Olympic Games as a teenager and then their careers finish before they're even in their 20s?
Yeah, so growing up, I actually never trained a lot of hours in the gym compared to a lot of other elite athletes. And I still don't. And of course, as I've gotten older, you have to adapt your hours a little bit more. You're not necessarily, building the exact same way or that base or foundation that you had to when you were younger. But I would train 20 hours a week. And I would train 5 days a week for 4 hours. And that was my base. And, on top of that, I would build in strength and conditioning or a little bit more of the injury prevention, or, your extra physio, mental performance, that kind of stuff on the outside of that. But my core hours in the actual gymnastics club were about 20 hours a week, and they still are. I do, strength and conditioning on top of that now, but I think not overtraining has allowed me to have that longevity in the sport. And then also over time working with my coach, he gives us a lot as we've gotten older in the sport. He's given us a lot more flexibility and freedom and independence. So he wants us to work on ourselves as our own human being, our own independent self, to go into the gym and kind of figure out how much we can handle, how much we think we need to do, how we can build our confidence, because sometimes you need that coach to push you, and he's there to do it. On days where I'm like, oh, I'm a little bit sore and tired, I'm not sure I'm going to be able to do it. He's like, okay, well, let's try. And if we need to adapt, we need to adapt. But I want you to at least try, because some days it's really hard to push yourself. But I'm a very self-motivated athlete as well. And I think that has served me a lot, is going into the gym with the time I have and making use of that. And over the years, working a lot on my independence factor, which was definitely difficult at the beginning. So I was like, just tell me what you want me to do. But I think it's really important because you actually learn, okay, actually, I don't need to do 3 more reps. I know I'm good. This is all I need to do. Or my body's really sore. So I'm just going to focus on these skills today. Or actually, even though I'm sore, I can push myself. I know that I'm just sore, but I have energy and I'm not tired, and I can still get these numbers done. So I think not training or not overtraining as much, paired with a little bit of a different approach in the gym and a little bit of that independence factor of actually figuring out what works for me from myself, has allowed me, especially as I've gotten older in the past, 5-10 years, to experiment a little bit more with my training and see what helps and what doesn't. But I think a factor in the competition results is also phasing your years appropriately. So you're not necessarily doing all of your hardest stuff all the time for 4 years, every single quad. It's been about looking at the different years, what the main goal is, how we're going to get there, what we want to try, and what time of the year we're going to do all the hardest skills and routines.
Are you learning new gymnastics at the stage in your career you're at now, Ellie, or are you just essentially mastering preparing for a competition and competing and the art of that?
I think every quad, they change the code. So you're forced to learn a little bit of a different makeup of your routine or to learn new skills on different apparatus. But a lot of my routines have had core skills that have stayed in. And then it's just been maybe about tweaking the order or upgrading a few for certain times of the year. But I think I still am learning new skills, and especially on uneven bars, I've learned a lot of new skills, I would say, in the more recent years. But on beam, on floor, I've played around with, but now I've kind of found a level that is good for my ankles, and we stay at that, and that's what I'm able to do. And then vault, we played around with a little bit, but I would say uneven bars, I've learned a lot of new skills on. There's always a lot of skills you can learn on that apparatus, and I've spent a lot of time on it. But on the other apparatus, it's kind of been just that base routine that we've tweaked here and there or upgraded or not. Because at this level, to get those gains, it is so hard. And a lot of the time, it's about those combinations, those little combinations that you're going to do, or actually figuring out and weighing the risk benefit. So what you're actually going to be able to compete successfully and consistently all the time, compared to, well, I could learn the skill and put it in, but am I going to actually be able to hit it when the pressure's on in competition all the time when I need to? So I feel like we found a pretty sweet balance, but sometimes you have to push it. So say on uneven beam, I can't talk, on balance beam, with my back full, I'll put it in, not all the time, but it brings such a high extra amount of difficulty to my routine that it's worth it to put in, even though it's not always the most consistent. If you want to make those finals, if you want to win a medal on the uneven beam, balance beam, if you want to win.
I would call that baby brain, Ellie. That's what I use as my excuse, but you don't have that excuse, unfortunately.
I don't know what it is. I don't know. But yeah, if you want to win a medal on the balance beam, you have to kind of get into that certain level of difficulty.
Take
and so that
risk,
was
right.
Yeah, it's a risk that you kind of have to take. So I think it's just about knowing yourself as a competitor and knowing what you're able to handle or how you compete, and then building your routines kind of based off of that.
Ellie, was there a point in time where you feel like you stopped competing against others and started only competing against yourself? And do you think that that is maybe the difference between the athletes that are competing at the top level in the sport and maybe the ones that are on their way up to competing at that level?
Yeah, absolutely. There has definitely been that shift in mindset. I feel like when I was younger, it was a lot about competing against others. And then as I've gotten older, it's been a shift of actually, like, me as an athlete and pushing myself to be the best that I can possibly be, and then competing against myself in the sense of, I want to go out there and I want to do my best gymnastics and kind of see where that puts me, or I want to go show exactly what I've trained. I want to go And, it depends on what the goals are, but be really consistent with the routines that I'm training and competing, and less about your competitors. I've worked a lot with mental performance as you go into these big meets to try and like not even focus on other people. It's just solely about your process and what's within your control. And your other competitors are outside of your control. So trying not to spend time and energy thinking about what they're doing or what they might do, but instead focusing on what you need to do and what you're capable of doing, and trying to put yourself in the best position on that day to have it all come together, and then see what happens and where the cards fall outside of that. So I think that's definitely a shift in mindset that I've had. It's definitely a common practice. You have to keep working at it, because it's not just like, oh, I've got it, I never have to think about anyone else ever again. You always are consistently working on it. But I think it's also a really, really great tool for those younger athletes to know that it's not necessarily about going and competing against everyone else, but it's also about increasing, my level of gymnastics. If I had just focused on staying and competing against other athletes, maybe I actually wouldn't realize that, okay, even though I might be, beating these select few athletes, I need to still work on increasing my difficulty, or working on the artistic component, or working on my, these little details that actually play a huge role in the overall level of my gymnastics. And that's going to help me to get to the goals and the dreams that I have.
When you look at last year, Ellie, your fourth Olympic Games, again, you were very successful for Team Canada and individually. And when, if you were going to go ahead and do some research on Ellie Black like I did before this episode, it's very hard not to look at your career and see that there's one thing missing. Is that in your mind? Are you thinking about that? Is that a motivating factor in terms of you continuing for 4 more years into the LA cycle? And is that something that gets you up every morning and still working hard?
Yeah. So I think, yeah, if you're looking at my career and the accomplishments, there is like one thing that's missing. And that's always been a dream of mine, whether it's individual or team, was to win an Olympic medal for Canada. And I think the biggest thing that I've learned over the years is it definitely motivates me, but it's not the sole reason why I do gymnastics. I do gymnastics because I love gymnastics and I enjoy it. And to me, there's a bigger picture. And it's not just solely about results, but it's about helping the sport grow as a whole and breaking barriers for females in the sport and inspiring others and showing, positivity and all of these different factors within the sport that don't have to be result based, because a lot of the time in our sport, our self-worth is tied to how many medals I won or what results I had. And I think it's really important to know and show that it's not just about the results. It's not about the medal count. It's about, I think, who you are and what you do and the impact you have. And that has been something that's been huge to me. And again, not saying that it's not important to have those goals and those dreams and those things that drive you. But I think for me, it just can't solely be about that. And that's not why I want to stay in the gymnastics world for another few years and try and go for another Olympic Games or LA. Obviously, that is a goal and a driving factor, but I think it's important to know that it just can't solely be that one thing. And there's so much more that is so important from sport and what we get, and not to tie our self-worth to the results or what we've accomplished in our career.
Do you think you guys have a shot, Ellie, of winning a team Olympic medal in 4 years' time? Like, what would that look like? What's the depth of gymnastics in Canada looking like at the moment? What's that next generation that are coming through, many of whom I'm sure have been inspired by your career, looking like?
Yeah, so going into this next quad, I'm excited. We have a lot of younger juniors that are moving up into the senior category, a lot of new seniors this year, and a lot of amazing athletes that are pushing like the difficulty factor. And I think that's something where we lack a little bit. Is there's a few apparatus that we are a little bit weaker on, and we just need a few more athletes who have a little bit more difficulty all around. So I think that's something that we're trying to work on over the next few years. There's definitely really, really great potential. These athletes are doing incredibly. They've just been competing, the start of this year and starting to build. So I'm really interested to see in the next few years, what kind of difficulty they're able to achieve and working on that consistency factor and all kind of coming together as a team. So I think it'll be very interesting over the next year or two to see. I always have hope. I always have faith in our team. I think if we can, come together with the leadership that we need to have, with the cohesive mindset, with all the coaches and the athletes to really work towards this, I think you have to believe it to make it possible. So I always have that belief there. I have the belief in, our team to be able to do that. And who knows, we might have a few of the older athletes sticking around for a few more years. It's hard because we just came out of the last Olympic cycle. So, we don't quite know where people are going or what's going to happen in the next few years. But I'm really excited to see this team and what we're able to build and accomplish over the next few years, because I think we have some really great coaches and athletes who are going to be working together, and just really excited to see what we can do with also 4 years of planning. And, last time we only had 3 years. This time we've got the 4 years to really, really, really utilize that, and hopefully have, the ability at World Championships, not only the Olympic Games, but at World Championships, at those multi-sport games, to really have some great overall team results and individual results.
Ellie, has there been some big changes to the gymnastics rules in this cycle on the women's side of the sport, and how have they impacted the construction of the routines you're looking ahead towards in the next few years?
Yeah, so for me, it's impacted my uneven bar routine a lot. They've downgraded a lot of those turning skills. So my element, the black, which I got named after me, which is also kind of crazy because uneven bars was my worst event. So if you had asked me when I was younger if I was to have a skill named after me, on which apparatus would it be? It would not have been bars. But so it's also pretty amazing for those younger maybe listeners out there. Like, if you're not great at something at the beginning, don't give up on it, because you can always get better. You can always improve. But here we are, still on uneven bars, trying to, change my routine and upgrade to a different routine. So we're going to be working towards restructuring my uneven bars routine, and maybe taking out a few skills or adding in maybe some new skills, but it'll be a different setup of the routine, and just working on basically over the first year or two, figuring out what can be consistent, what's going to work and what might not, and just playing around with different constructions and different skills. And then same with balance beam a little bit. We'll have a lot of that kind of core routine that's still there, but try and play around with a few different skills or combinations and see what's possible and what's consistent. And I think the 2 leg events of floor and vault will probably, for me at least, stay pretty similar. But I think the biggest impact was on uneven bars for this quad and for over the next few years.
Ellie, it's been a brilliant conversation. I think the last question I'm going to ask you, because I think this will be really valuable for maybe young female athletes that potentially are in their later teenage years, early 20s, and they want to build a gymnastics career like you've done. You've been to 4 Olympic Games, and I imagine that's only been possible because you've been able to financially support that lifestyle. How would you go about doing that today in 2025? Because it's something that's not spoken about a lot, right? But in order to be able to still compete at the highest level and be an elite athlete, it's expensive, and you've got to figure out a way to financially support that. What would be your advice for a young athlete that's maybe wanting to have a long career, but is maybe at the point in their career where they don't have much income and they're having to maybe think about walking away from the sport?
Yeah, and that is such a real struggle, I think, that a lot of athletes go through. Women's, men's side, being able to financially make it happen, especially as you're becoming a little bit older in the sport, you have a lot more costs that are falling on you. It is not an inexpensive sport. It is expensive. And the only reason I'm still actually able to continue and do this is because I've got, great support around me, and I'm working with other athletes always to continually advocate for athletes and for the compensation, and trying to find the funding that, we need to be able to continue doing the sport, and working with your organization to be able to do that. I think it's important for them to realize, our organizations, that if you want to keep athletes in the sport for longer, if you want those experienced athletes to continue, we need to be able to support them to be able to do so. And outside of that, I've been very lucky because my family has been very supportive over the years, but I've also been very independent in this for a very long time. And one of the biggest things is reaching within your community, reaching out to those people who are within your community, sharing your story, trying to find those people who are going to want to support that, want to support you, and figuring out how you can kind of create these partnerships together. But I think it's really important because I live in my hometown. I've trained and competed here my whole career, which is really important to me, coming from a smaller city, from a smaller province. But just because you come from a smaller area, it doesn't mean that you can't make that happen. And there's great support all around you. There are always people who are wanting to help, and you just have to go kind of take those steps to be able to share your story and basically ask for help. And there's nothing wrong with that. And that's how you're able to continue doing what you want to do. And people want to support that. So I think it's just about not being afraid to try, not being afraid to reach out and ask for those communities around you, and going even farther than that. It's really important to have a wide reach that you want to work with. But I have incredible brands that align with me, that are able to support me. I've got a lot of community support here. And I think all of that kind of comes together to be able to help me to financially make, it feasible to continue in the sport. So I think it is there, and reaching out to those people around you, working with your club to be able to make, some agreements. I know we have a lot of athletes who coach because, their clubs are a lot more understanding when you have to travel and you get to stay in the sport. You get to share your knowledge with those younger generations. So trying to think outside of the box and not be afraid to try new things, not be afraid to talk to others, reach out to those older athletes on your team, to those people who have come before you, and ask what they may have done. And reach out to your federation and have these conversations, because we need to continue having these conversations in order to make change for the future. And I always want to help those younger athletes, the next generation, to be able to kind of follow in my footsteps and be able to do what I've done.
I think that's amazing advice, Ellie, and I always feel like young athletes, they see dollar signs and they want a Nike sponsorship and Adidas, when actually you shouldn't underestimate the support of that local community. And actually, if they can reduce your costs, whether that's paying training fees or paying for nutrition or whatever it might be, that's, in the beginning, exactly what you need. So incredible advice, Ellie, and thank you again for giving us your time today. Ellie, if people want to follow your journey, where can they find you online?
Yeah, they can primarily find me on Instagram. I document a lot of my day-to-day journey and everything that I'm going through on Instagram. I also have a website, which is attached through my Instagram as well. And my Instagram handle is Ellie Black _. And that's kind of where you can follow me for the primary day-to-day.
Well, thank you, Ellie. All the best for the rest of 2025, and hopefully we're going to see you there in LA 2028, and I'm sure you'll have a big smile on your face or whatever. So, yeah, thank you again. We really appreciate it, and this has been a fantastic conversation.
Thank you.